with pleasure by the empire. I mean, that just took incredible will and commitment. What ended up happening to his sons?
Well, it took a long time, but they finally were gotten back in a prisoner exchange. But that wasn't the fate that happened to Francis Lewis's wife. Francis Lewis was from New York. He signed the Declaration of Independence. His wife was captured by the British and imprisoned and kept in freezing weather without a change of clothes for 6 months, with hardly any food. And they saw that she was about to die, so they let her go, and she died within a month.
I was about to stop you. That was their little trick. A lot of times, especially with little kids, Andrew Jackson's mother and brother, they let them go and they died 1-2 days later, one a week later. So they starve you like a concentration camp victim. They had his mother and brother in a church concentration camp. That was their British term for it. They invented it, for those that don't know. And then they took them on wagon back and put them out to die at their house. Go ahead.
Well, and then there's John Hart. He signed the Declaration of Independence and was at his wife's dying bedside when they ran in and said the British are coming. He had to flee. The British burnt his house, chased away his kids. He had to live in fields and in caves, and broke his health, and he died before the war was ended. That was John Hart. Then there was Richard Stockton, popular guy in New Jersey, Chief Justice of their colonial Supreme Court. But the British offered amnesty, whoever would return to being a politically correct loyalist. And so one of Richard Stockton's neighbors led the British to capture him when he was escaping, a traitor. And so Richard Stockton was put in the freezing cold, treated with severity because he was one of the signers. He was brutalized. His library, which was one of the greatest in America, was destroyed. His money he had in continental currency, which became worthless, and he was released. The government never paid him back. He didn't get any stimulus bailout, and he died bankrupt at 51 years old in 1781.
What about some of the famous British massacres, too, putting people in buildings and killing them, burning them?
Well, one of them was a gentleman, Johnny Burgoyne, landed in Canada and was coming down from New York, and he got the Indians to enter into a treaty, and it's actually referred to in the Declaration of Independence, where he basically told the Indians to go out and terrorize the American. Well, one of the stories was that the Indians couldn't tell who was a loyalist and who was an American, and David Jones left his New York village and went to join Johnny Burgoyne and told his fiancée, Jane McCrae, that he would come back for her. Well, at close, one evening, the Indians came into the camp, their scalps, and one of them was the long red hair that David Jones recognized belonged to his fiancée, Jane McCrae. And so they were fighting over who would get her scalp, and then they killed her and just cut it off. And so gentleman Johnny Burgoyne had to go and tell these Indians to cool it, and they got offended and left. And so here is Burgoyne banned in the middle of the New York forest, and the Americans finally surround him and win the Battle of Saratoga. But this is where we see that the Declaration talks about how the king has incited the natives of the frontier to butcher the inhabitants of our colonies. But over and over again, another one was John Witherspoon. He was the one clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. They burnt his college. Princeton was the college that he was the president of, and his son, James Witherspoon, died in the Battle of Germantown there in Pennsylvania. A little interesting trivia, Reese Witherspoon is a distant descendant of John Witherspoon, the actors there. But we see that they paid this price to have their names on that document. One interesting story is John Adams. He was the first U.S. ambassador after the war to the King of England. And he made international news when he refused to bow to the king. I mean, here's a former subject of the king, but now he's an American citizen, and he goes in there and doesn't bow. He had a backbone of steel. And so that set the precedent that no American president or any representative of America would ever bow to any other monarch until, of course, President Obama bowed to King Abdullah. But we see that the founders, they vehemently wanted to defend their independence, And that's why I'm sure that they would be turning in their graves when they would see this power taken away. You know, our founders bathed themselves in philosophers that talked about how to separate power. Again, they took the powers of the monarch, broke them into 3 branches. They separated from the federal to the state level, tied them up with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. But there were other philosophers that wanted to concentrate power. One of them was Machiavelli. He lived 500 years ago in Italy. And Italy wasn't Italy. Italy was a bunch of little kingdoms and dukedoms and papal states, and they were always fighting each other. Venice fighting Genoa, fighting Siena, fighting Assisi, fighting Perugia. And so Machiavelli said, you know, if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop all this infighting. So he wrote a book called The Prince for Lorenzo de' Medici, a rich guy in Florence. And in it, he advocated the ends justifies the means. In other words, if the prince wanted to capture a city, but the people didn't want him to, well, if he goes in there, the people will hate him. But if the prince pays insurgents to kill cows, burn barns, create terror, the people will cry out for help. The prince will come in and kill the guy that he bribed, and everybody will treat the prince like a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it.
So we're talking about government-sponsored terrorism with Machiavelli talking about it, which the big neocons say that is their top teacher. Final segment, few final calls. We've got to have theamericanminute.com gentleman back. Bill, stay there. Final segment with you. What the 4th of July is really all about.